The rain began as a polite tapping on the windshield and turned, almost immediately, into a relentless sheet of noise that erased the world beyond my headlights, as if the road itself were being washed off the map while I drove into the unforeseen. There's a special kind of darkness that only exists under thunderstorms. No moon, no stars, just rolling pressure and the wet hiss of rain pressing against everything like a held breath. And that night felt like stepping into it with my eyes open and my guard down. The wipers thrashed and the glass gleamed with rivers, and the radio died between stations, so I was left with static and the low, tired thump of a faulty subwoofer, a heartbeat that didn't belong to the car or me, pulsing in the empty lane as if keeping time with something outside. By the time I saw the detour sign, the temporary reflective rectangle jutting from a mud-slick shoulder, I was already too far from cell service to double-check the route, and turning back meant tempting a flood that was climbing the ditches like fast fingers. I took the detour because the sign told me there was no other way, because the rain demanded decisions that felt obvious in the moment and absurd afterward, and because I didn't feel alone anymore, even inside my locked car. The side road narrowed until it could barely be called a road. Two thin tracks braided with wet leaves that stuck to the tires like tongues, and trees leaned over me with the glossy backs of their leaves shining like watching eyes whenever lightning arrived and left again in hurry, like a parent checking a sleeping child. There were old wooden posts where a fence had once been, moss on every cut surface, and beyond them a smear of dark field riddled with sinks of water that flashed like broken mirrors. And every time the thunder rolled, I felt it in the steering column, in my elbows, in the cavities of my teeth, like someone tapping from inside bone. When I finally saw a house, it was because the lightning stopped pretending and held long enough to paint the world in flat, surgical white. And there it was, 3 stories of black windows in a veranda caged with gingerbread trim, a whitened skeleton of a place that seemed to have been waiting all along at the end of the detour. The mailbox at the drive had no name, only a number half peeled from warped paint, and the number repeated in my head in a way numbers shouldn't, like a chant in reverse. And suddenly I wanted to laugh or cry or just stop the car in the road and close my eyes until the rain decided what I was supposed to do next. The engine coughed when I parked, and I told myself I was only pulling in to wait out the hardest band of rain, to see the windshield again, to breathe air that didn't smell like plastic and damp and hot copper wiring. But I left the engine off, and the dark pressed its forehead to the windows and listened back. Rain changes what wood smells like. It lifts rot from old boards like a memory resurrected. And when I stepped onto the veranda, the planks answered with a hollow tone that traveled through my soles, up my calves, as if the house were a drum and I was the mallet, and somewhere inside something awoke to the beat. The door was swollen and half open, held not by a latch but by water and old paint clinging like brittle lips. And when I touched it, the door let go with a wet sigh and swung slow. The smell of dust and wet cloth and the sweet sour breath of a flooded basement spilling over me as if I were being tasted in return. The foyer swallowed the storm behind me. The rain remained in the world of the porch, replaced by a new sound. A slow drip inside the house, a methodical tick of water falling through floors, each drop finding the next in a vertical chain, like a spine of noise that ran the house from roof to earth. Lightning rearranged the shadows, and I saw the stairwell, its banister shining like a river from all the palms that once slid there. And at the first landing, a mirror caught whatever light there was and smeared me across it, a streaked, doubled stranger in a rain-dark coat who looked like a warning concealed in a reflection. I told myself I would stand in the foyer, count to 60 while the storm decided whether to move on and then leave. But the drip ticked in a way that drew me, that suggested the house had a leak in its thoughts, and I needed to find where they were escaping. Rooms opened off the hall like mouths, each with a different aftertaste. Mildew, old sugar, iodine, attic dust, and a series of framed photographs slumped along the wall, water-warped. Their images bubbled like blisters as faces dissolved into fossils of ink. And yet some eyes remained intact and busy, their small manufactured gloss reflecting me as if they recognized a late guest. The first room on the left held a piano with a cracked fallboard. A wet handprint stained the wood. Not recent, not old, an amber tide mark with finger trails curved downward, gravity's handwriting on varnish. And the keys looked like a jaw that had lost count of its teeth. Outside, thunder arrived late behind the lightning. A rattle, then a hollow roar, and the rain raked the shingles like nails through hair. And I realized the drip I followed wasn't random. It harmonized. It lived in the rests between the storm's phrases, as if the house answered in its own pace, never competing, always adding. I spoke out loud without meaning to. "Anyone here?" And my voice came back wrong, softer, as if the room were ashamed of me or of the question, and the shame belonged to someone else who had asked late, asked poorly, asked after ignoring another kind of request for too long. The draft moved past me smelling of wet iron and apples gone to cider, and I knew, without knowing how, that there was a cellar, and that I would go there, and that I would not like what the cellar remembered.
The door to the basement had been painted shut and then kicked open at some point, leaving a brittle lace of paint along the jamb like a frill of dead lichen. And the first step sank a fraction under my weight with a soft bark of nails that failed and then held, a promise given reluctantly in the dark. The sound changed on the stairs. The thunder went farther away, and I felt close to the earth again, and the drip became the room's only language. A patient syllable falling into a shallow pool, then another and another, until I could almost tell when the next would come, like predicting a heartbeat after counting too long. A chain hung from a naked bulb, and I pulled it and nothing happened, and then something did, late. A bloom of jaundiced light that made the concrete gleam like the inside of a fish. And everywhere were jars, hundreds on old shelves, cloudy glass with shadows moving inside, like clouding smoke. The labels had been written in a tidy hand that belonged to someone who finished everything they started. Dill, peaches, beets, tongues. And that last word didn't make sense until I picked up a jar and held it to the bulb, and the light refracted through the brine and found something pale and muscular and barbed with hair, like the roots of a pulled weed, floating slow in its sleep. The jar was warm in my hands in a way the basement wasn't, as if what was inside had kept time better than the air. And I set it down gently because it didn't feel like a thing one should wake with a bang. And under the shelf, a small river snuck through a crack in the foundation, rain finding its own path home. There are places where sound repeats itself even when it's new, as if the air has been taught a phrase and will hum it under everything forever. And in that basement, the humming shaped a name, not mine, never mine, but spoken near me, near my left ear, in a voice that didn't travel the air as much as it traveled bone. The bulb dimmed and then brightened, though I hadn't touched the chain, and the shadows of the jars trembled on the wall, long, crooked tongues tasting plaster, while the drip above accelerated and then missed a beat, and the silence inside that miss had the weight of a held door. In the middle of the floor, where water made a shallow, milky mirror, a hatch set flush with the concrete, iron rings slick with rust blooms, and the water collected around it with the care of someone gathering a child's hair before cutting it, neat and devout and wrong. My knees cracked when I knelt, my fingertips found the ring, and some part of me that still belonged to the car and the road and the original route begged me to stop, to let the rain have the world it wanted and leave the rest to dry in time. But curiosity is a story's engine and a person's ruin, and the iron lifted like a lid of breath after drowning. Cold air exhaled upward from the hatch, like a sigh saved a century, and beneath lay stairs carved into dirt, slick with clay, the kind of steps made by someone who didn't want to be followed, but made them anyway because going down had been unavoidable in the life they lived here. The smell changed, wet chalk, earth under nails, something salt-sweet like a butcher's apron, each layer of scent stacking until the awareness felt like taste at the back of the throat. And I realized the drip I'd followed had never been a leak in the roof. It had been this place rehearsing syllables through the bones of the house to see if anyone would answer. The staircase was narrow enough that the walls brushed my shoulders, and the light above felt like weather, a thin yellow fog that turned every breath visible. And somewhere beyond the bottom step, I heard a string, the faintest violin tonic held too long, except there was no music, only the ceiling's long, wet breath and the suggestion of a note inside it. When my shoes left the last stair and found packed earth, the dark pressed closer, and my hands in front of me didn't belong to me anymore. They were tools someone else had borrowed through time, and I used them to find a switch that wasn't there, a lamp that had never been installed, and instead found a cord that moved when I touched it, because it was a rope. Pulling the rope lifted a wooden shade I couldn't see, and the storm's thin light, filtered through a horizontal slit at ground level, flattened the room into a single plane of grays, and along that plane something stood that I mistook for a coat rack until it turned and revealed the architect's regret of a face. It had the proportions of a man who lived his life on stairs, a lean built of ascent and descent, a mouth cautious and long, and eyes that dodged mine, and then found them, and then wouldn't leave. And every part of my heartbeat changed tempo without agreeing on a new one. "I'm late," I said, to no one, to him, to the storm, to the version of myself who hadn't taken the detour, and I swallowed and tasted iron, as if the basement had licked me back, politely, to make sure I was real and unwelcome. The figure's clothes were wet despite the cellar's shelter, as if rain happened to him wherever he stood, and a line of water worked down his cheek like an absent tear, and his hands were empty, but the shadow they cast looked occupied, held at a careful angle as if carrying something heavy that wasn't there anymore. He didn't move closer. It's worse when they don't move closer, when they let the space do the talking and the rain translate, and all the parts of the house above me creaked in a slow alignment, as if the scene required a frame before the portrait could be hung. "Do you live here?" I asked, and it felt like an insult as soon as it left me. And he tilted his head in a way that said the word live was a problem in our conversation, like a hinge installed backward in a door that still opened if you insisted. The rope touched my wrist again, a thread in a crowd, and for a heartbeat, I thought I felt someone small move past my leg, the ghost of a child's momentum, the particular quick carefulness of a body that knows where the splinters are. The slit of outside light sharpened with a lightning flash, and I saw more details. Kiln bricks lining a recess, old hooks and beams, a galvanized tub tipped on its side with the ring of dried salt near its lip like a closed mouth, and on the far wall names carved at shoulder height, repeated by different hands, the same names again and again, like practice that became ritual that became the only thing left to do. "Who are you here to scare?" The question arrived from somewhere behind me, soft, and then right in my ear, though I was alone on the steps. Words dressed in the calm of someone who knows the answer, but wants to see if the student is ready. And the basement air seemed to hold its coat a little tighter around its shoulders. The figure's mouth worked once, and the rain outside changed pitch, the way it does when wind turns the drops sideways. And I thought, not for the first time, that the weather uses houses as instruments, and this house had been tuned for a song I didn't want to learn. He lifted his hand, and the shadow with the weight lifted too, and the tilt revealed a shape the light could not agree upon. A cradle, a bundle, a ledger with a strap, and for a split second, smell replaced sight again. Milk long dried, camphor rubbed into wool, and under the acid sweet of formalin that didn't belong to any farmhouse cellars of my memory. Somewhere above, something heavy shifted on old floorboards, a slow skid like a dresser turning to face the wrong wall, and dust fell in a thin string through the crack beside the beam. Vertical snow settling on my hair with the gravity of someone else's decision.
When the thunder came, it wasn't outside. It was inside the wall to my left, a clotted roll like a barrel being walked end over end through a narrow hall, and then 3 hard knocks, spaced in the rhythm of a question like a child learning to knock the adult way and over-practicing. "You followed the detour," the voice said from the stairwell where no one stood, and I understood with the sudden simplicity of an answer key that the sign on the shoulder hadn't warned me away from a flood at all. It had shepherded me, sure and gentle, into this house's habit. The rope brushed my wrist a third time, and this time I held it. And in the instant of touching, something held me back with equal pressure, not to stop me, not to pull me farther in, but the way two people pass a heavy object together across a narrow span so it doesn't fall through. The figure on the far side took one step, and the step made no sound, and my ears filled with cottage noises from a time before mine. Wet wool steaming by a stove, the faint tick of a wall clock's tooth slipping, a woman humming a line with no melody, just syllables rearranged like a charm. None of it frightening out of context, all of it unbearable, stacked the way the basement stacked smells. He reached a second hand toward the shadow cradle ledger, and just as he did, the slit of light narrowed as if mud pressed at it from outside, and the room met the dark without fanfare, and the last thing I saw was his eyes adjusting to the loss of light faster than mine, finding me where I stood as if he'd practiced this part 1,000 nights in a storm. I didn't run. The stairs wouldn't allow it, and anyway, leaving fast would have meant touching the walls with my shoulders, and the thought of that touch felt like agreeing to a contract written in damp. So I backed until my heel found the first rise, and then the next, stepping into my own footprints as if the house were willing to let me leave in the same shape I had arrived if I could produce the exact steps. The air shifted, 1 degree warmer, then cooler. Breath moving in the throat of the house, and with each breath the drip returned somewhere above me, patient, unbothered, as if nothing had changed and I was the only thing that remembered the basement differently now. At the top, the bulb shivered itself out with a soft ping of filament surrender, and I felt the darkness accept the loss like an accountant, adding the number to a column that was already long and precise and old. The foyer's mirror waited at the landing, and for a fraction, it didn't match me. My reflection paused half a blink too long, water beating on the glass where there was no leak, little domes of rain standing in place like domes of breath. And behind my head, the outline of a tall shape in a coat that glistened as if rain happened to it wherever it stood. I stepped closer, and the domes rolled, and I saw, through them, tiny inverted rooms where the house refracted itself smaller and truer and less patient. And I understood that rain wasn't outside. Rain is a thing that chooses what to wash and what to leave, and tonight it had washed me into a story the house could keep telling even if I left. Outside again, the veranda boards felt softer, as if the rain had found the old paths of feet and decided to reopen them. And when I reached the car, the door handle was warm like a hand that had just let go. The residual human heat trapped in metal for an impossible moment. The engine caught, but the radio offered only a clear, new voice folded inside the static, a child's patience reciting a list of names I'd seen carved in the wall, each spoken as if waiting for the listener to claim it, to say here, to say present, to accept attendance. I put the car in reverse, and before I could look back, thunder, real thunder, sky thunder, walked across the fields, and lightning put the house on display one last time. Paint blistered, windows blind, roof line a shrug, and the slit at the ground along the foundation gleamed like a narrow eye closing. Gravel popped under the tires like knuckles, and the detour sign waited at the end of the drive with rain running down its face in lines that looked, for the smallest second, like fresh paint pulled by a gloved hand, letters made and unmade by water. I took the original road as if I had a say in it now. And when the trees thinned and the highway gathered me in its lit lanes, there was a moment so quiet after the storm that my ears searched for the drip and found it anyway. Inside the dash somewhere, inside the vents, inside the dark ductwork of the car where rain could not be, ticking the seconds of a story that had not ended by leaving the house, only by carrying it away. Hours later, back in my apartment where the storm had not reached, I lay in the blue dark and listened to the building breathe, water in the pipes like distant applause, and thought of the jars lined on the shelves, and the way the rope had met my wrist like a helper, not a trap, a collaboration prolonged by weather and habit.
The heater clicked and my pulse raced with it, matching an old rhythm learned too quickly. And when sleep came, it brought a room that knew my name and a mirror that waited for me to catch up, and a child's voice behind me practicing the right way to knock. Counting, never quite getting it wrong. There's a special kind of darkness that only exists after thunderstorms. No rain, no thunder, just the aftertaste of pressure and the inventory of what was moved around without anyone watching. And that night, it settled over me like a damp ledger closed without signature, patient and precise, and willing to open again if asked. In the morning, every surface smelled faintly of wet wood, though the windows were dry. A thin hint of cellar and camphor and chalk, the way clothes carry smoke long after the fire's gone. And when I held my breath, I could hear it. Once, just once, from somewhere under the floor, the soft, polite knock of someone practicing. Then the pause, then another, as if asking who I was, here to scare. I didn't answer because some doors of questions and questions answered become hallways, and hallways in old houses are longer than they look when rain chooses them, and I had chosen enough for one hauntingly dark night.
The first flash hit before the rain, a white sheet that wiped the sky clean and left the neighborhood for a heartbeat like a photograph, crisp and empty and already a little haunted. And I remember thinking the storm would be a comfort because storms had always been lullabies in my life, loud but honest, a noise that meant nothing was sneaking up on anyone tonight. By the time the rain arrived, hard and sudden, the gutters were shouting, the alley took on a shallow current, and the maple by my window brushed the glass with its wet hands, each touch a cold whisper I tried not to personify and failed. I set the recorder on my desk out of habit, a hobby turned ritual, capturing the sound of downpours to lay under late-night stories, the way some narrators layer rain beneath voices to soften the edges of fear and make it palatable, like putting a blanket over a snarling dog and calling it sleepy. It was almost midnight when the power flickered and then steadied, and the storm reasserted itself with a blue-veined lightning strike that made the blind shiver and my coffee jump in the mug, small earthquakes under a larger, louder one, and somewhere down the hall a neighbor's door closed like a polite warning. I pressed record anyway, because if there's one thing storms teach, it's that noise is a kind of courage, and because nights like this ask for a witness even if the only witness is a cheap microphone and a tired spine. Around 12:15, the building settled into the rhythm of a weathered ship, each beam a mast, each pipe a rope singing softly in a black ocean, and I heard footsteps above mine that didn't belong to my upstairs neighbor, lighter, stopping every 4 paces, then restarting as if obeying a set of instructions left in chalk on a schoolyard. The rain thickened, changing pitch as wind shoved it sideways, and through the blinds I saw the alley turn into a ribbon of reflections, long versions of the security lights smearing themselves toward the drain like ghosts, learning to swim, while thunder arrived late as always, an apologetic giant tripping over the edge of the sky. My phone buzzed with a local alert, flood watch until morning, and I almost laughed because the only thing in this building that had ever flooded was memory. Every tenant left behind traces, the paint was layered with lives, and sometimes the hall smelled like someone else's cologne that hadn't lived here in years. It was during one of those long, thunderless gaps that I heard a knock. 3 taps, measured and calm from the end of the hall where the emergency exit was supposed to stay chained, and the small hairs on my arms stood not from the sound itself, but from the way the building paused to listen to it the way a room pauses when a teacher enters. The second set of knocks came with a drag, like someone moving a bag that had caught on a seam, and it gave the knocks a personality I disliked immediately. Not pleading, not angry, just patient in a way that suggested the knocking could continue long after the storm, maybe long after the building. I don't believe in leaning into fear for sport. I believe in naming things so they stop believing they're allowed to stand over a bed, and so I opened my door, and the hallway light flickered not because of ghosts, but because the ballast was older than wisdom, and there was no one at the end of the hall. Only the red exit sign humming, and below it, the chain that should have joined the push bar to the frame lay loose like a necklace someone had unclasped and forgotten to pick up. The carpet was wet in a strip leading from the door as if rain had walked in on small feet, and there were marks where something heavy had been set down and then lifted again. Round prints that warped the pile into smiling ovals, repeated every 3 feet with the neatness of a person who practiced. The stairwell door opened without a sound, though it had screamed for years, and the stairwell itself held the rain the way a hollow tree holds the smell of lightning after a strike. A clean, shocked scent that felt like a new word on the tongue. Tin and lemon, and something that was not ozone but wanted to be. From the landing above came a whisper of cloth,
the sort of sound any building makes when it sighs out its heat and pulls a draft through. Except it stopped when I took a step and started again when I stopped, like a child playing freeze in the dark because the game is more fun when one person doesn't know they're playing. I climbed anyway, counting quietly, because numbers make ladders in the mind, and my hand trailed the rail where thousands of hands had left their oils, making the wood darker and smoother in a map of human contact I didn't want to think about tonight. On the 4th floor, the door to the old storage level, locked since the renovation, stood ajar by 2 fingers, and the air that slipped through that gap carried with it the smell of damp paper and stale detergent, like a laundromat inside a library, and under it, a sour, animal note that tugged at an old instinct that lives behind the teeth. Lightning washed the stairwell, and for a second the frosted glass of the storage door became a silver screen. A shape crossed it, thin and deliberate, and I knew from the height it wasn't a child, and from the speed it wasn't an elderly neighbor, and my body did the math faster than my thoughts could disagree. I slid the door open with the care of a person who has done this in dreams and been punished for moving too fast, and the room beyond sloped under the roofline, rafters like the ribs of a sleeping animal, boxes stacked in soft towers with labels in strangers' handwriting, umbrellas in a milk crate like a bouquet for rain. The far wall held a row of old windows, painted shut years ago, now sweating, each pane turning the storm outside into a blurred watercolor, and in front of the middle window stood a metal tub on a wheeled dolly, the floor around it dark with spread water like the halo of a spilled baptism. The tub wasn't empty. It was filled with rainwater that could not have gotten there unless someone had carried it up or unless the room had learned a trick. And floating in the water were photographs, hundreds, faces and rooms and pets and cakes, all the shut-eyed moments of strangers caught mid-blink, and every time thunder rolled, the photos turned to fraction like fish.
I stepped closer, and the smell of wet emulsion rose to meet me, vinegar and thyme and the faint sweetness of glue. And the faces in the tub looked up through the water at the ceiling, at me, at the bulb, as if asking who held them, who would set them back on the shelf, who would slide them into a book that survived this storm. There was a pattern to the photos. Each had a wet thumbprint in the same spot along the bottom edge, the print of someone who had sorted them with care even as they destroyed them. And a small white tag taped to the dolly read, "Returns," in block letters that looked like the handwriting of a person who had never once been late. A shadow slid across the windows and stopped on the far pane. Not a body, not a head, but an outline of something held up on the other side, like a portrait or a mirror facing inward. And the sense of being observed came on so strong it made my gums ache. The way fear sometimes finds bone first because it's a faster conductor. "Hello," I said, like a question, like an apology, like the first word of a prayer. And the storage room answered with the exhausted flitter of moths disturbed from cardboard, a soft hail of paper dust that settled in my hair and smelled like other people's summers. The tub creaked, a metal complaint under a new weight, and the photos nearest the surface curled as if lifting their faces for air. And below them, the dark of the water felt deeper than the tub, as if the floor had become a well for the length of this storm. A footprint appeared on the wet floor beside me where there had been none. Narrow, arched, the size of a small woman's foot, and a second followed, angled toward the tub, and the sound of wet sole peeling up from concrete made something inside me flinch in a way that was more memory than reflex. Someone moved through the room without displacing air, the way a thought moves, and the heat from my body drew a fog on the nearest window in the exact shape of 2 hands placed on the other side of the glass, fingers long and careful, pressing toward mine and then away as if testing a membrane. I turned, slow to keep the world from slipping sideways, and now the shape behind the pane had a face, or rather the absence of one where a face should have been. A pale oval like an overexposed photo, details washed out by light or time or water, and yet the gaze landed, accurate and cold, right at the hinge of my jaw. The rain outside intensified, and with each sheet that ran down the glass, the face on the other side multiplied, a stack of paler and paler ovals like a flipbook of erasure. And behind that darker, a silhouette carrying something close to its chest the way people carry sleeping children or precious boxes of bones.
The tub spoke again. No other word fits. And the nearest photo rose and turned and bumped my wrist. And the image on it showed this room decades ago. Same windows, same slope, and in the middle, a metal tub on a dolly, and a woman standing with her hands on the rim, smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes, those eyes cloudy and lit by lightning. The door behind me closed with a finality that belonged to furniture, to heavy drawers, not to a lightweight storage door on a cheap hinge, and the sound made every box in the room flinch and settle, cardboard sighing in a choir that lasted too long. I knew then that whatever I did next would be cataloged. This room had that taste of ledger and receipt, of things kept in duplicate until the heat of a flood welded copies together. And so I lifted the photo and let it drip and set it back in the water, a tiny, respectful funeral repeated hundreds of times. The face on the window leaned close until the fog from my breath ringed its absence in a halo, and then the pane, which had been painted shut for as long as I lived here, trembled in its frame as if someone outside had run a fingernail along the seam and found a soft place. "This is a bad idea," I said to the room, to the tub, to whatever had learned how to come upstairs when it rained. And one of the boxes to my left collapsed inward, its bottom falling out with a papery groan, spilling old cassette tapes dressed in mold like fur, and the labels all said "returns" in the same hand. Returns, 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 as if the word itself were a spell that guaranteed the thing would come back no matter how far it was thrown. The tub's water darkened at the center, a bruise blooming slowly, and something small rose through the photos. A key, old and ornate, teeth eaten thin by rust, tied with string like a tag around a bird's leg. I fished it out, and the cold of it bit so deep my palm ached, and when I lifted it free, a thread of something followed like a vein, and I realized it wasn't tied to the key at all. It was hair, long and colorless, the kind that fills apartment drains and disgusts anyone who doesn't remember they shed. Only this strand had no end I could find before panic set my hands down on the cart, and the key clicked against the tub like a tiny bell. The face in the window tipped, as if curious, and a crack spidered from the lower corner with a sound like ice surrendering, and rain began to bleed through not in a leak, but as a fine, continuous mist that smelled like cellars and old bleach and something floral that had died in its vase on a hot day. Footsteps resumed above us, that 4-beat pattern, and stopped, as if the person walking were matching breath to a counted phrase. And between those steps, another sound, soft and off the rhythm, like a second set of feet trying to catch up without being noticed. The key pulsed cold in my hand, the way dead metal sometimes feels attached to weather, and memory surfaced. A rumor about this building before it was condos, back when the laundromat ran the first floor, and the owner had a side business, renting storage to people who needed to leave things where the city wouldn't ask questions, and how the storms would back up the drains and float secrets from the basement like driftwood. I looked at the door and knew it would not open easily now that the room had decided I belonged to its inventory. And I looked at the windows and knew the glass would cut in a polite, efficient way that would make it seem as if nothing had happened at all until morning.
So I did the only thing that made sense in a room that kept records. I tried to make a trade, because that's how ledgers settle: debit and credit, entry and exit, a thing taken and a thing returned. And I reached into my pocket and pulled out a photo I always carry. My mother on a pier on a gray day, hair tied back, her hand up against the wind in a wave that looks like a blessing now that she's gone. I set it gently on the surface of the tub, and it floated, and for a moment it was just a picture in water, and then the bruise in the center reached for it like a mouth, and the photo dipped and caught the light, and I saw, impossibly, the storage room reflected in the glossy surface, not as it was now, but as it had been the day the other photo was taken, with a younger tub and a woman with clouded eyes, and somebody small at her hip looking up with a neutral curiosity that looks like love in old pictures. The key in my hand warmed, a fever under skin, and the face in the window backed away from the glass by a fraction. and the mist slowed as if the rain outside had turned polite, and the door, when I tried it, moved a half-inch in its frame and stopped, as if asking for one more number to balance the sheet. Thunder walked across the roof, and the footsteps above matched it, quickening, and in the space where thunder wasn't, I heard a voice on the other side of the door say, "You forgot something." Not accusatory, not kind, just true in the way certain facts are true, even when nobody wants them. I understood then that trades in this room weren't about objects, but about attention, about who would keep what and for how long, about the ledger of being seen. And I turned back to the tub and looked for my mother's picture and didn't see it anymore. Something small touched my ankle, a cool pressure, as if a child had leaned on my leg to steady themselves while reaching for something fragile. And I didn't move because there are times movement is a kind of rudeness you can never take back. The key's teeth pressed crescents into my palm, and I closed my hand around it and said, in a voice that didn't feel like mine, "I will return what I borrowed." And the room exhaled in a long, patient draft that made the windows hum and lifted the top layer of photos into a small wave that lapped the rim of the metal like a tongue. The door opened the rest of the way, not with a swing, but with an unfastening, the sense that something with many small hands had undone many small closures to let me go. And the hallway outside was brighter than a storm should allow, white with the kind of light that comes from bulbs and rules, not from weather and chance. I stepped out and didn't look back, because looking back is a way of saying you might be persuaded to return. And I took the stairs down in the measured rhythm the footsteps had taught me. 4 beats and stop, breathe, count, listen, continue, until the second floor where my door waited open the way I had not left it, my recorder's red eye blinking as if the room had been practicing speaking while I was gone. In the recording later, between the rain and the hum of the fridge, a second voice sits under mine, quiet and precise, naming months and dates and first names and last, a litany of returns that sounds, if you play it loud enough, like thanks. I slept for a while to the deliberate applause of rain on the fire escape, and in the smear of morning, the alert on my phone updated. Flood watch lifted, streets passable, minor damage reported, and a thumbnail photo showed my block, with the alley shining like a tongue, and my building looking ordinary and overqualified for a new day. When I dressed, my jeans left damp crescents on the floor where they had dried overnight, and my palm held the indentations from the key longer than seemed reasonable, shadows of teeth that faded only when the sun reached the top of the maple and laid a dry hand on the glass. I made coffee and stood at the window and thought about ledgers, about how rooms keep them even when people forget, about trades made without receipts, about faces on the other side of glass that wait for storms because storms are fair. They touch everything, they wash indiscriminately, and in that washing, some things rise. Down in the alley, a maintenance man wheeled a dolly past the drain, a metal tub strapped on with a bungee, and as he turned the corner, he looked up as if he'd felt someone watching and tipped 2 fingers from his forehead in a salute that could have been for anyone or for the building or for the kind of night that leaves its smell on your clothes long after you've showered. When I left for work, the storage floor door was closed again, the chain back on the exit, the carpet dry, and only one change announced itself in my apartment with the insistence of a new habit. On my desk, beside the recorder, lay a small wet tag with block letters that matched the ones in my dream, and on it, in neat pen, a single word that I understood was not a command, but a kindness. Return. The forecast called it a slow mover, a bloated weather system that would park over the city and empty itself until the drains learned new languages. And the truth arrived in the form of a sky that lowered by the hour until it felt like a ceiling pressing a palm to the top of the head, asking for patience and promising weight in return. By dusk, water threaded every surface into a single instrument. Gutters drummed, signage rattled like teeth,
and the long awning above the bodega at the corner beat a war rhythm that turned the block into a heart, and each bus that passed dragged a curtain of spray that erased the sidewalk and left it again, as if dealing cards. Even inside the station, the air tasted brassy, like a coin left on the tongue, and the tiles shone with a skin of slick that converted every footstep into an audition for balance, while the overhead speakers coughed apologies about delays in a voice too calm for the weather's intent. The storm had knocked the schedule crooked. Trains arrived wrong or not at all, and the platform crowd moved in eddies, strangers forming temporary shoals around the brightest bulbs and the least dripping sections of ceiling. And somewhere a child laughed the way children do when every sound is a toy, high and sharp and uncomplicated. I found a pillar, leaned into its cool, damp spine, and listened to the rails hum with a note that meant nothing and everything. Metal caulking to metal in private about what it could bear, a secret shared under the city's skin. The first odd thing was the poster, the one that usually sold mortgages with smiling teeth and clean counters. Tonight it sold something else, or maybe it spoke in a different voice because the paper had slumped, its glue softened by damp, and the faces stretched until their eyes pooled, and the smiles lengthened past kindness into the country beyond it. A drip formed at the bottom corner of the frame where no pipe ran, and fell in a perfect rhythm that matched the broken LED clock above the stairwell. And when the two sounds aligned, the lights flickered the way a person blinks when a gnat touches a lash, involuntary and a little angry. A man with an umbrella the size of an idea pushed by, the fabric shivering with each drop's impact, and the wind he brought carried the smell of wet concrete and warmed brakes, a scent that belongs equally to subways and storms and new fear. The second odd thing was the announcement. Just one word, a line of static, then return, spoken too softly to be the PA and too loudly to be a person speaking to a friend, the sound landing on the platform like a coin someone didn't want and walked away from. The third odd thing was smaller, a wet handprint where the pillar met the floor at calf height, as if a child had knelt there to steady themselves and then stood without smearing the mark, a perfect stamp of presence in a place where everything else blurred. When the train finally entered, it didn't so much arrive as appear, its headlights carving tunnels inside the tunnel, carving the storm's hiss into two bright cones of intention, and the wind it carried was colder than the platform deserved, clean in a way that felt borrowed from winter and withheld from everyone else. Doors slid and the car exhaled stale climate, coffee ghosts, the lint scent of long coats, and I stepped into a space that had been recently emptied, the floors striping with water from shoes that were no longer here, each stripe a note on a staff only the wheels could read. The carriage wore a layer of soft sound, rain stifling the roof, the tires whined, the overhead lights dental hum, and beneath that a lower layer, a room tone with a pulse, like the echo of a song 2 cars away that nobody wrote down. I took the pair of seats by the joint between cars, where the accordion rubber bellows shiver with every curve, because there the train feels the most like a living thing, and pulled my hood off and shook the water, and the droplets briefly beaded on the vinyl and then slid, patient, toward the floor with the gravity of old clocks. Opposite me, a woman in a blue raincoat watched the door, not the world, handbag clutched in a way that suggested good habits, and an older man with a newspaper he did not read held it up like a shield against a wind that existed only in his memory. We left the station into the city's wet throat, tunnel illuminated in flashes by the occasional utility light, and each time those lights passed, the windows became mirrors and the car became a room where we were performers for ourselves, caught in our poses looking lonelier than we felt. The train slowed. The announcement apologized from a throat full of rust. And then the lights took a breath. Not a flicker, not a failure, but an inhale. The kind of pause a storyteller uses when a room has settled enough to be told the worst part. In that pause, a shape stood in the vestibule between cars, behind the glass, not yet in our car, and not content to stay in the other. A person in profile angled toward the door with a posture that said, listening, and a coat the color the city assigns to puddles when they're done reflecting. The face was a suggestion, the way faces are in windows when night claims the glass and the inside light does its best. A collection of planes and a lighter oval where skin should be. And yet the sense of being watched set off the small alarms along the arms that evolution installed for snake grass and cliff edges. The doors between cars are supposed to be locked and dangerous, the kind of threshold that exists to scold curiosity. And yet the latch in front of me hung at an angle, as if someone had taught it a choice.
The woman in the blue coat saw it too. Her fingers tightened around the straps of the bag in the incremental way pianists press into a soft chord to make it share a secret. And the newspaper man lowered the paper just enough to see over it with one eye, ready to raise it again if anything required him to be elsewhere. The train crept, sighed, committed to motion again, and the shape in the vestibule turned its head not like a person deciding, but like a compass needle finding north. And behind the oval of face, the smaller ovals of other faces ghosted in the glass, a palimpsest of commuters and storms, the city's habit of keeping copies in case the first ones are damaged. I told myself a story. It's a reflection doubled in bad light. It's a trick of perspective. It's the brain combing noise into pattern because that's its favorite job. And the story worked for exactly one heartbeat, for the length of a single light passing its bright baton along the wall. The latch lifted another degree, and a thin blade of colder air pressed into the warm, the kind that carries hospital on its breath, bleach and paper and copper pennies. A disinfected cold that is less about temperature than about rules. The door opened enough for a hand to slip through, palm pale, wet, the knuckles pronounced in a way that made the joints look like beads strung under translucent skin. And the hand didn't reach for the latch, it reached into our air the way swimmers test a lake before committing. Nobody moved first. That's the curse of public spaces. Courage waits for consensus, and consensus never arrives on time. And so the hand hung, and the door waited, and the train took a mild bend that made the rubber gator sigh like an old animal. Then a sound arrived from the roof, a cross between a spill and a whisper, and I realized the storm above was tracing us, the way the sea traces a ship, traveling with us along the length of the line. And then, faintly through the ceiling, came the soft patter of a different rain, lighter, more insistently rhythmic, like fingers drumming on a drum that isn't supposed to be there. The hand withdrew, the door eased shut on its own, as if deciding nobody inside was worth the trouble, and the lights released their held breath, and the car remembered how to be ordinary, tired, damp, late. We reached the next station and the doors opened to a platform empty enough to look staged, the wet concrete shining like wet eyes, and no one got off and no one got on, and the speakers offered a single chime and then went mute as if swallowing what they meant to say. The woman in blue stood, thought better of it, sat, and the newspaper man folded his paper tight, a square of armor for a different battle. And I saw the corner of the mortgage poster again, only now it read differently. The stretch of the faces made their smiles into cuts, and the slice of water at the frame's edge looked hungry. It started with a smell, because fear is an animal, and animals lead with the nose. Wet concrete, then bleach, then camphor, then underneath the sweet sour of something bottled too long and growing impatient, the scent of a place that keeps what isn't asked about. The next car's door opened and a man walked through with the slowness of someone who has practiced moving without urgency. A janitor's cart hung following him like a pet, except there was no cart, only the ghost of one in the way his body leaned a degree to compensate. He wore a coat the color of puddles, the same as the shape before, and water tracked his shoulders as if rain had its own ideas about roofs. And in his hand he held a ring of keys that didn't jingle, their bites wrapped in cloth the way people soften bells when they have to move among sleeping things. He passed without looking at anyone, which is the city's truest courtesy. And when he reached the vestibule door, he set his hand on the latch, and the latch behaved as if it had been waiting specifically for that touch. opening clean and quiet, offering itself like a solved problem. As he slipped between cars, the air behind him changed temperature by a single precise degree, and the light above his head flickered, not with age, but with decision, and then he was gone into the rubber bellows, and the sound of the train swallowed the rest of him. When he didn't return by the next station, the car developed an opinion about it. People's eyes began to meet briefly in the guerrilla way strangers confer in emergencies, a nod that means we saw that too and none of us is crazy alone. And the woman in blue stood a second time, steadier, and this time the newspaper man stood with her because ritual sometimes requires witnesses. "You saw him?" she asked, and the question loosened the air enough for others to breathe. And someone at the far end said, "He works on this line," with the confidence of a guess made brave by the need to explain. And somewhere a phone camera rose and then lowered because the glass offered only water. The doors opened again, the platform present but wavering, and above us the station's mouth spilled a different sound, the sharp, close music of rain hitting metal at a rate that announced intention. And the kid laughed from earlier return, but thinner, as if a toy had been taken away. I stepped into the vestibule because someone had to move the story forward, and the rubber gator smell closed over me, hot tar, dust, that vague sweetness of old plastic, and the storm spoke through the roof, coating itself into a tattoo that felt like a message learned by hand. The next door stood ajar, only a little, the kind of opening adults notice and children do not, and through it a sliver of the next car glowed colder, as if the lights there were on a different grid, a different appetite. Inside, the seats had emptied themselves. No newspapers, no umbrellas, no human mess, just water beating on surfaces that had lately been warmed by people and now were not. And in the far bench, a small pool had collected, a deliberate puddle that reflected the ceiling lights in a row of trembling moons. On the floor, in the aisle, something lay that first looked like a rope, then like hair braided too tight, then just like a line someone had drawn with a wet finger, a path for a child to follow when they were asked to come home. The keys sat on the nearest seat where a person would have placed them if they needed both hands for something tender, wrapped in cloth, each tooth softened to sleep, and the fabric was damp and smelled faintly medicinal, as if it had known hospitals and careful rooms and rules posted at eye level. "Sir?" I said, because sir is the right word when you want to name the space you're addressing. And the answer came from above, from the roof, from the storm, a series of taps that did not belong to drops or expansion joints or even animals. A pattern that learned the car's rhythm and then played against it, syncopated, certain. The woman in blue stood behind me now, her bag at her hip, her eyes on the puddle, and she whispered, "Do you smell that?" And I nodded, because camphor and bleach and damp paper are a chorus that means storage, inventory, returns. The car lurched and stopped between stations, a rare courtesy in this part of the line, and the lights took that inhale again, generous and cruel. And in the reflections on the window, I saw us doubled, and behind our doubles, two more shapes, one tall, one small, the small tucked to the tall like a comma. The tall lifted a hand in the reflection the way people lift hands to hush, and the rain on the roof went from language to applause, a soft, sustained clapping that made the entire car seem complicit. And I felt a tug at my coat, light, testing, the way children check if a pocket is sewn shut before they commit to theft. I looked down and the line on the floor, the rope that was hair, that was a wet path had moved a fraction toward the door, the way water creeps under things looking for the lowest point. And the keys on the seat made the smallest sound cloth can make, a sigh of reposition, as if someone had almost picked them up and then decided to ask first. The announcement system awoke with a single chime, and then a voice, not the usual one, said, "Please stand clear," in the tone of a person about to move something heavy, but nothing moved except the storm testing the roof for weaknesses. "Return," the voice added. Not a command, not even advice,
more like the name of the next stop on a line that doesn't appear on any map. And the lights exhaled, and the car shook and started again, carrying all of us, accounted and not, toward a station the schedule did not recognize.
We reached it without arriving. The train slowed into a cavern that had fish-scale tiles like the old stations, but these were fresher, sheen intact, and the platform had no posters, only blank frames waiting. And the name band along the walls said nothing in the spot where a neighborhood should be announced. The doors opened and air came in that had never been outside, the kind that lives in long corridors and cares about rules. And along the platform, spaced evenly, stood metal tubs on dollies, their rims polished to a soft brightness by hands that didn't want to make noise. Each tub held water up to the lip, and in each, if you looked too long, faces rose. Smiles stretched wrong by damp, eyes washed pale, the common artifacts of a city's memory that the storm had been hired to collect. And the applause on the roof quieted here, as if the audience had been asked to listen. The janitor stepped out from behind a pillar that had always been there and never had, his coat still raining, his hands bare now, and he held them palms up the way people do when they mean to show they are not armed and also when they mean to receive. He looked at me not unkindly, an appraisal a teacher gives a student who has arrived late but with the correct book, and he nodded at the keys in my hand and then at the tubs in a way that said ledgers are simple, take, bring back, be counted. I stepped onto the platform because stories don't end inside cars, they end at thresholds, and the cold air wrapped my lungs in gauze, and I realized the station did not smell like trains, but like a basement that has made peace with its water, and the treads of my shoes left crescents that filled with a shine immediately. The first tub I passed showed me my own face, elongated by ripples, my mouth a long cut, my eyes 2 coins, and under that my mother's face in a photo I carry only sometimes now because the edges are softening, and then a neighbor from 10 years ago, the one who sang opera at 3 a.m. like a ghost with good diction, and then strangers upon strangers, each face coming up for a breath and then sinking to let the next one try. The janitor pointed, not at the tubs, but at the blank poster frames, and in their emptiness a condensation formed, letter shapes from breath or weather, and they arranged themselves slowly into a word that everyone on the platform read differently, but that meant the same thing. Returns, refunds, reparations, remembrance, an accounting term for memory. The woman in blue reached my elbow, her bag strap a diagonal of intent, and she said, "I think we can go." And I realized she wasn't talking to me, not only me, she was talking to the small comma shape that had tucked itself at my hip without weight, the way presence sometimes does when it doesn't want to be a burden. The janitor's hands remained open, and in them was neither demand nor threat, only the quiet gravity of process. And behind him, farther down the platform, a child's handprint dried in a pillar in a shape that matched the one I had seen by the base of the one at my station. I put the keys on the lip of the nearest tub, cloth and all, a small ceremony, and the water accepted them with a bell note I felt more than heard. And in the ripples that followed, a face rose that I didn't know, and then another that I did, and then 100 I never will, and the platform took a breath together, a small lifting of shoulders, a reset. The lights here did not flicker, they dimmed and brightened with the pulse of something large and tired that had learned how not to fail, and the storm above stopped clapping and started whispering again, a million small opinions confessing themselves to the roof. The janitor nodded, a ledger balanced, and turned and walked along the line of tubs, his coat still raining, his shoes leaving no wet footprints of their own, and the woman in blue took my arm, an anchor in reverse, and guided me back toward the car that had brought us, not because it was safer, but because stories, like trains, run on schedules even when they get lost. We sat, the doors shut with a sound that belonged to homes and not machines, and the car started forward. And through the window the station slid away, and the name band along the wall remained blank, and the tubs receded like silver eyes closing. At the next ordinary station, with posters and noise and a schedule that had recovered its courage, the doors opened and people got on and off and dripped and apologized and frowned at their phones, and the lights did what lights do when they don't have to think. When I finally stood on my own block, the storm had thinned into a fine, stubborn drizzle that makes clothing feel honest about its choices, and the city smelled like rain's aftertaste, stone, brake dust, the green ghost of leaves bruised by water, and the sky had learned to be higher again. In the stairwell of my building, at the turn between floors, a small wet handprint dried into the paint in a shape that would be gone by morning and back by the next slow mover, a mark that felt less like haunting than like acknowledgement, a note in a ledger that someone else keeps but that I can read when the light hits it right. In the apartment, I took my recorder from the desk and played the hour I had captured without meaning to. And under the rain and the hum and the municipal apologies, a second rhythm sat, syncopated, certain, a tapping that learned the city's heartbeat and then wrote another line under it like harmony. Around the 2/3 mark, a voice that is not mine says, close to the microphone, please stand clear, and then softer, return, and then so quiet it lives inside the noise, a child laughs, and someone shushes them, with the tenderness of people who have practiced. I slept with the window cracked in case the storm had one more thing to say, and in the hour before dawn I dreamed of a station with no name, a ledger balanced in water, and a coat the color of puddles walking ahead on a platform that never got any shorter, no matter how many steps it took. And I woke with the certain knowledge that some schedules include stops we don't print, because some stories are kinder when they're told only in weather.